to reveal to others. But it was Friday, and we were allowed to leave the office early. I could have darted straight home, made plans for the beach, but instead I absent-mindedly wandered into the old mall again, telling myself I was going to check out this thing or another. It was hard for me to admit that I wanted to see them, the two people with whom I had built a genuine rapport over the last couple months. I told myself those weren't my intentions, but it was blindingly obvious. And conveniently enough, there they were, boxes, readjusting their coarse and boxy habits, which I could only imagine wearing in such heat. We immediately struck up a conversation with the rehearsed kind of joviality that was so pleasant to me at the time. Toddy, if there's something to be said about nuns, it's that they know how to make people feel welcome without ever overdoing it. This little space felt so refreshing when compared to the air-conditioned nightmare of a firm. We got to talking as usual and, without realizing, I mentioned that I was free for the afternoon. The nuns were delighted, and insisted that I come with them to the convent for tea. At this point I was feeling the kind of weird, warm tingles that sometimes slide down your back when you go to the hairdresser, or when a soft-spoken receptionist tends to your needs. That kind of hypnotic warmth that I associate with, I guess, service and comfort. And it almost made me want to cry. I said yes. Whether the nuns' intentions were purely altruistic or whether there was a conversion motive, I don't know. Maybe they saw potential in me to be like them. Who even becomes a nun in this day and age? I have to assume they're low on numbers. But I didn't care about any of this at the time. As soon as I accepted, Tomasa and Giovanna burst into a thrilled chit-chat and beamed with what seemed like genuine joy, as they probably hadn't entertained a guest in a while. They seemed to be amused by how the sisters would react to their guest, and began to work out the logistics of the operation. I don't know much about convents, but I'm sure nuns aren't allowed to simply bring in people off the street. At the same time, it didn't seem like they were doing this in secret. It's not surprising that there was no air conditioning at St. Francis, or any similar amenities. Despite the background hum of comings and goings, errands and small talk, beyond the storefront was a place of monastic contemplation. I think the heat started to get to me at that point. I began to feel childlike, impressionable, far too easy to guide. Tomasa and Giovanna lead me through a back door that opened into a wonderful little corner of the convent's inner patio, a sunlit place with little more than an iron-legged marble table and a few thin chairs. The arrangement looked like it had stood there, unperturbed, for 1,000 years. It sat in the middle of a walled little corner of the patio that was separated from the main square by a tight hallway, as if built in secret. The side and back walls were covered in greenery that was soothing to just look at. In a moment I became aware that it was, without a doubt, Tomasa and Giovanna's secret corner, a place where they came to find some privacy, to tend to the plants, to drink tea and eat cake and gossip about the other sisters. I feel weirdly humbled to have been let in. I heard the moving around of furniture behind me and then the door closed, and immediately I began to hear baby wrens, chirping in the distance. I no longer felt like I was in the city. And I began to relax, to let go in ways I hadn't allowed myself to do for months. Let us go down a trip to memory lane, specifically to the summer of 1997, when Aaron was finally kicked out of school. His dad has always been negligent, as you know, so every day was party times in his house, as you also know. Truly this was a glorious time. This was the summer of Sister Zero, of the convent, of the arcade incident. This was the summer when Kelly got caught and suspended for the mess she made in the boiler room. This was the summer when Brad tried to stop smoking like 12 times and failed consistently. Coincidentally, this was also the summer when Brad got very dark in terms of music tastes and we all had to put up with it. Remember all that shit he played in the car when we all drove down to the coast? I mostly remember Swans. He was huge on Swans. This is how we started going to the guy's apartment. You know he runs a little record store out of that place. Guy's the textbook definition of an audiophile, reminds me of the guy from Ghost World, the movie. Brad was looking back then for a vinyl of Swan's live album. The title had castration in it. I don't remember too well. I was never into things like that. I don't find music of that type cathartic, even if I have professed my love for Suicide, the band, not the act, several times with great enthusiasm. Anyway, the first time we went there it was fairly innocuous. It was just me and Brad, one Friday after school. I think we also asked Kelly to come with us because we wanted her to fucking explain what she had been doing in the boiler room. But back then she had holed herself up in her home, poring over her books. You know how she is, she needs her space. She's weirder than all of us put together, which is saying a lot. A lot. Anyway, The guy's apartment was tiny, and it was made to seem tinier by the fact that it was lined with shelves which were themselves lined with records, and other than that there were piles of cassettes, mostly bootlegs and mixtapes, and there were also at least 5 different record players and musical paraphernalia that I'm not enough of an expert to comment confidently on. And there was practically no furniture. And for some reason there were porcelain bowls strewn about. Guy was big on cereal, I guess. He opened the door and he was stubby and unkempt and wearing a Captain Beefheart t-shirt. He didn't have much in the way of social graces and quietly invited us in. He offered us coffee. I said no. Brad said yes. You know how he is. He never refuses a cup of coffee, even if it's laced with hemlock. Brad and the guy started talking about music and I felt like I should be a part of the conversation as well. They started off on points that we all had in common: Joy Division, Monster Magnet. We got into an argument over whether NYC Ghosts and Flowers was really bad or just bad. Then I started to zone out when the two of them started talking about bands and movements that I didn't even know existed. I remember the name Syzygy, Baroque Hell and Spiritual Masters of Shangri-La. I zoned out. I remember that at some point they mentioned a record called Baby Sex. The name stuck to me for obvious reasons, which I'm pretty sure is by the Residents. Anyway, I ended up falling asleep in the couch where I had settled. Afternoon sunlight, the time when all the kids are coming home and you're being lazy, listening to crackly AM radio and procrastinating over homework. That kind of stuff gets me woozy. I woke up abruptly when one of the guy's ferrets jumped onto my lap. Did I mention the guy had a bunch of pet ferrets? They all had names like Patsy Cline and Howlin' Wolf. It was cute. I noticed that Brad and the guy had moved to the kitchen, which was tiny and adjacent to the living room, and were talking in hushed tones about something. At this point I realized that it was already dark outside. I glanced at my watch and it was like 7:30. So I called out to them and their conversation stopped abruptly. The guy almost dropped the beer he was holding. They both stared at me as if they had heard a disembodied voice or one of the ferrets talk. I guess they had forgotten I was there. Brad could really get into music when he wanted to say nothing of the other guy. So we said our goodbyes. I hurried the whole thing along, and Brad left with the record he wanted. I remember it now. It's called Public Castration is a Good Idea. Quaint title. He put it in the back seat and we drove back. He dropped me off at my place. He was playing something really soft and tender. She's a favorite of mine. First time I heard something like that playing in his car all summer. On the way back I asked him what had he been talking about with the guy all that time. All in all we had been there like 3 hours, and he said nothing, just music and trivial shit. He's an interesting guy, but a little weird. And I agreed and didn't pursue things further. He dropped me off and I went to sleep because for some reason I was unholy tired, despite having done nothing but sleep for the last few hours. The next day Brad didn't show up at the regular place, which was weird because it was a Saturday. I called his cell phone but it apparently had no batteries. I called his phone number and his mom answered. She said that Brad was in his room. I could hear his little brother crying in the background. Back then he was just a baby. Apparently Brad had been studying. Ha. That day I was with Aaron and Toddy and we both called bullshit on that. Because it's Brad. He doesn't study for tests, he just wings it. We decided we would march over to his house and see what was up. His mom opened the door for us. She looked a bit distressed, but then again Brad's mom has never been a big fan of Brad's friends. She is nice and polite though, and she offers us cookies, and that's good enough for us. Brad's sister was playing Mario or something in the living room and the door to Brad's room was closed. We knocked and he finally opened. Brad looked like he hadn't slept. There was an unlit cigarette dangling from the corner of his lips. He had that hilarious spotty attempt at a beard he got when he forgot to shave, and bags under his eyes. He looked at us as if it made no difference who we were and let us in. This is when I realized that Brad's record player was spinning the new Swans record, but it wasn't making a sound. Brad had a nice used record player he got at a really good price. It worked really well for what it was. Aaron tried to play around with it and Brad told him to be careful. Toddy just grabbed a magazine and sat down to read. She was out of it that day. I think she was still mad at Brad for what he did to Joey. So we just sat there in silence for a minute or so. Aaron and I were mostly waiting for Brad to offer up an explanation. Toddy was in her own world. Brad raised up his head. He was practically falling asleep in his chair. He was about to talk when we heard this unearthly screech from hell coming from the record. The speakers sprang to life and out came this hellish sonic torture that blasted the room at full volume for all of 4 seconds, and then it stopped and everything was silent again. Brad's mom stormed into the room, incredibly angry, wanting to know what that was. Brad sheepishly apologized, said it was a malfunction of the system, wouldn't happen again. She gave us all a disapproving look and shut the door. Really? We don't look weird, so parents usually like us, but when you spend as much time around us as Brad's mom did, you learn to roll your eyes at everything we do. I guess. Brad started to spill the beans at this point, but not before hooking a pair of headphones to the record player and disconnecting the speakers to spare us of any further torture. He said that he had talked to the guy who sold him the record and he had told him that this was some sort of special first issue version. Apparently it was recorded live at a different venue than the one on the official version or something. It was a pretty nerdy distinction, but apparently Brad was so excited about the notion that he played it the second he got home last night. The problem was that the record had been playing all night and it doesn't make a sound except for periodic outbursts every hour or so, apparently like the one we had just witnessed. At this point I felt a horrible headache coming on. Well, fuck that, I said. It's probably scratched beyond recognition, or the guy conned you. Take it out and we'll go bitch at him right now and get your money back, I said. But Brad shook his head. He explained further. Apparently he had been listening to the record all night on headphones so as to not disturb his family, and the record is not damaged at all. It's just different. He nervously lifted the headphones up and offered them to me. I gave him a blank stare. Then I put them on. First I only heard the usual vinyl crackle and pop. But then I realized that there was music playing, but it was playing incredibly softly, like it had been recorded from miles away. From what I understood, this was Swan's Alright. I listened for about 30 seconds, there were other sounds, like I think I could hear something like a wood chipper in the background, but Brad took the headphones back and put them on the floor. He explained to me that the outbursts, the extremely high volume screams coming from the record, were unpredictable, and that's why he couldn't listen to it continuously. You had to crank the volume all the way up to hear the music at all, and if one of those high volume sonic blasts came at you through headphones at full volume, that was it. You'd go fucking deaf or damage your eardrums beyond repair. Listening to the record for any long stretch of time involved putting yourself at risk of that. Aaron and myself listened to the story with moderate interest. Dottie was still out of it and would continue to be out of it for the rest of the day. In fact, it won't even make a difference to the story if I stop mentioning her. You know her. She's stubborn. When she's mad at someone, she doesn't acknowledge their existence. She and Brad wouldn't really make up until months later. Brad looked at our reactions as if he expected them, but then he looked at us and leaned closer, as if to tell us the punchline.
The thing is,
He started. I remember this word by word.
that this isn't a Swan's record. This is a list of places being recited repeatedly.
I didn't really react. So aside from being a dangerous piece of shit, it wasn't even a Swans record. It was some random bootleg, probably by some random band that never got anywhere. I said fuck it and put the headphones on again. I strained my hearing to make out the lyrics. The singer, who was definitely not Michael Hero or whatever his name is, was indeed screaming out locations of places. Places in our city. Record stores. When I confirmed this, the street names, the locations, everyone looked at me weird. Suddenly this became interesting. This had either been recorded by a native of our city or it was simply inexplicable. But my hearing isn't so great. I couldn't make out most of what was being recited. Back then we were bored and there was nothing else interesting going on. Kelly was still cooped up in her house, and with Toddy and Brad not addressing each other directly, the whole group was tense. So we decided we were going to find out what that guy was saying. So we decided to call up the guy with the best ears, and that would be Nathan. Remember back then? We weren't really friends with Nathan. We had conversations every once in a while, but I guess he was a bit too cool for us or something. He wouldn't be a part of the group until a year later or so. It was kind of funny how much he got into the whole thing, and how fast. So the next day we called up Nathan, asked him to hang out and get a couple drinks. He agreed. When we were in the store where we always did our requisite non-ID drinking, we casually and briefly summarized the story for Nathan. He was fascinated by the whole thing, but, as he told me later, he didn't really believe us at the time. He was mostly humoring us because